Do not sit for 20 years. We're tired of hearing that people are sitting and coping with depression for 20 years. This is 2020. We're going forward here, and you don't need to stay stuck anymore. You can heal your life, and that's our message. And contemplative intelligence will help you get there. And we started to notice at our center many, many years ago that people would come in for depression, addiction, all kinds of different traumas from all over the world, from different countries. But yet something was always the same, that the minute they stopped overthinking, their hearts began to open and empathy came in and made them well. We very, very strongly believe that emotional regulation is the future of medicine. Activating empathy is something you cannot do when your mind is racing. So if you can stop that mind, which cannot experience any other feeling but the feelings that it's already experiencing, then you can start to look at, and instead of tolerate things like depression, anxiety, and stress, you can actually heal these things instead of trying to put band-aids over them. Empathy is a product of how people have experienced their lives up to a certain point. People who've suffered, and some of them have suffered really, really badly, have experienced very little empathy in their lives. And what it does, obviously, it doesn't open you up, it closes you off. And the minute you close off those feelings and emotions, your mind then leads the way, and it leads the way in a way of survival, of fight, flight, and freeze. And that's it. To become empathic is to open up vulnerability. It's not to be soft, but it's to open up enough vulnerability to create something new. And if we're looking at getting from the back of the brain, from the limbic system, which we essentially call the downstairs of the brain, if we can get from downstairs to the upstairs, or the front of the brain and the cerebellums and so on, then we can move out of survival, out of that fight, flight, and freeze, not by thinking more. I always say the intellect is sharp and it will do nothing but cut you to pieces. You move from the back of the brain slowly, coming from a place of empathy. So when people sit and they feel the empathy of others and they connect to people on an empathic level, we find the most miraculous thing happens in a short space of time, days or weeks even, is that people all of a sudden start to heal. They start to think differently, they start to feel differently, and they even start to look differently. People who've suffered a lot of trauma develop a non-empathic identity, and they come across, you can see them from across the room, they come across as flat, cold, isolated, and very, very defensive. And that is the lack of empathy. So how do you connect when that happens? And the connections are everywhere. It's how would you relate to a loved one if there was no love? How would you have a loving relationship without empathy or love? So it doesn't work. And those many examples are as big as the broader examples of how we're seeing things unfold in the world today. We're seeing a lot of non-empathic action. And I can tell you something, it's not working. We've got to look at the figures. We've got to see that addictions are on the increase, that the use of pharmaceutical drugs is just through the roof. And that's not working either. And, since we opened the center, it's been 10 years of research with a ton of different people suffering a host of different manifestations of non-vulnerability. So these people are literally trapped by a mind that is saying, we've just got to survive here. And when you're making decisions without a feeling and jumping into action, impulsive decisions create absolute chaos. They create an unmanageable life. You need to go from thought to feeling to behavior. And that's how you live your life. A good one, at least, where things are manageable, where you can access order as opposed to just chaos in your life. Managing chaos is not a good enough life. And in fact, a recent study was done where 90% of people, that's 9 out of 10 people, would rather sit when they have anxiety, addiction, something, a personality disorder, some block, some kind of life-changing block or struggle that they've got to face. 9 out of 10 people will sit with that and say, okay, how am I going to manage this? And they learn coping mechanisms rather than fixing it. They learn coping mechanisms to deal with whatever comes their way. And only 10% of people will sit down and say, well, how can I actually fix this problem? I can't live with depression. I can't live with anxiety. So more and more people are coming to us and saying, well, I've been depressed for 10 years. I've been borderline for 10 years. And we say, well, why? A non-empathic past, which unfortunately almost everyone you speak to today has a non-empathic past of some kind, where it's inevitable we experience trauma, we experience codependence. And that's okay, but you don't want a non-empathic future. And you can't have a non-empathic past and expect an empathic future. So we sit with the fantasy that we are going to be happy and we are going to be joyful and peaceful one day. But the reality is, unless you change the way you feel, the way you think, you'll never access happiness and joy and peace on a level that your mind's telling you is just around some imaginary corner. No, you have to do the work of stopping the obsessive thoughts and look at any behavior cycle, any behavior chain. It always starts with obsessive thinking, moving to compulsions. Obsessive thinking is in your mind. Compulsions are more in the body and the mind. It then leads to some kind of ritualization, habits, and actually a way of life. And once you're living that life, it's difficult to experience anything at the end of those cycles other than shame and guilt. So whether it's food, whether it's drugs, whether it's booze, or whether it's just an apathetic life where we can't find motivation to actually get going and change, easier said than done, we will never access those feelings. The research has been out for 50 years that we need growth and contribution to be happy. And I think the reason for growth and contribution being so high on a self-actualized scale is that you cannot get there without empathy. So this is the strange part, is that we found when people sit down, open up, and they think they're going to break down, but they really open up. They've broken down already. And when they open up and start sharing some of these feelings and getting the thoughts out of their way, listening to what other people have to say about the state of the world, about the state of themselves, those connections seem to somehow move people right around from the back of their brains to the front. So empathy seems to be a key to growth and contribution, to a life of purpose. And the strange thing about this key is you can only access it at a certain point in your life. So it's normally what we call, or Carl Jung called, the second half of life, where you are accessing these things only after you have had a breakdown and so on. Your ego defenses have been shattered. They're no longer working. You know they're not working. And you, the person behind the thoughts, behind the feelings, starts to regain control of their life. And when you regain control of your life and you come from a place of the heart, a courageous place of the heart, your empathy seems to go around and unlock things only when you're ready for it. So it's almost as if, unless you have had what people call a spiritual awakening in the 12 steps, or a conscious awakening, or a life change, or being reborn, whatever it's going to be for you, and these are just words, only then does it seem that empathy is the key to opening these things. So in other words, a life of joy, happiness, bliss, and so on that is sustainable and manageable into the long term can only be accessed by people with open hearts. And that is an incredible discovery, because it finds that if the way of the universe is love, then the key to opening it up, this universe, is love. So we find that empathy breeds self-regulation, and self-regulation is the future of medicine, it's the future of therapy, and it's the future of our well-being, personally and as a collective universe. Another thing that we notice for sure is a trend where people are not growing up, and we've done videos on Peter Pan syndrome, or Petra Pam if you're a female, and how more and more people are just not growing up. They're either going out into the world and coming back crushed, chewed up, or they're not leaving home and they're not creating these relationships with other people, probably because of this close off. And people who don't want to grow up seem to suffer from an empathic deficit. So they sit there and they regress, obviously, into the feelings of childhood. You cannot have new feelings unless you open your heart, unless you experience new thoughts. Otherwise, everything's working on memory. So we know that, right? You cannot experience new feelings and so on. So you regress back into a childlike state. Often people's emotions are set when they're 20 and 30, they set at around an emotional age of 15, 16, 17, because something happened there. Some thought came across them where they said, this is a bad place, or I am a bad person, or you're a bad person. And that needs to be overcome to move from 17 to 30, to live a life which you want, where you're growing and you're developing. I mean, we only live till 100 years old, you better get it going. And we find people at 30 and 40 are just not getting it done. And the people that do come in for the treatment will sit there, and the first thing they do is say, this has been 20 years. And then you start to understand why they called psychology the talking cure. It's a talking cure, and I think it activates the emotions and definitely activates empathy. So in our CQ training, our Contemplative Intelligence training, what we're doing is getting people out of survival into thrive. And we're simply starting off that process by opening up their hearts. And it's almost too simple to teach. So there's no need for complexity. But there is a need for open hearts. And it's these open hearts that heal open minds, not the other way around. What we're saying with something like contemplative intelligence is stop long enough to allow the silence to open up what has been closed for a long time. And those feelings of vulnerability, the mind will not like them, especially if you haven't accessed them in a long time. But open up, and the minute you fall into silence, which people don't want to do these days, they want to distract with everything all day long. They want to distract in bed, they want to distract at work, they want to distract on the bus, they want to distract when they're waiting. They want to avoid the silent spaces, and it is the space in between the bars that hold the tiger, and the silence in between the music that makes the notes. Now we see what that means, is you need the silences, you need the pauses to be able to self-reflect. In other words, reflect further than what you are just thinking. Self-reflection is higher reflection. It is you thinking about you, which is something that an animal cannot do. So that self-reflection activates the empathic process, which leads you to the front of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, or the upstairs, if you like, where you can be creative, where you can be spontaneous instead of impulsive, where you can create new feelings, new emotions, and new ways that you will react. So that is how you regulate your emotions on a day-to-day basis, by getting back into these emotions that were stunted by non-empathy. Open them up and then move forward with an empathic response. That's all that EMDR and the whole bunch is doing. CBT, whatever you're using, is all pretty much the same. Going back, looking for the negatives, and replacing them with positive, not thought so much as emotion. And that is how empathy is the key to the next generation being able to self-regulate themselves and heal what is completely out of control, over 50% in America. Heal depression, stress response, anxiety, and 10 personality disorders that are just skyrocketing at the moment. So be prepared to open your heart when you come into this life as an adult. In the first half of life, that heart is probably closed off. And in the second half of life, our job is to open that heart up. And contemplation is a practice that really can help you rewire yourself neurologically. Get down, allow those feelings to get down into your heart, into your body where memories are stored, and create something new. Do not sit for 20 years. We're tired of hearing that people are sitting and coping with depression for 20 years. This is 2020. We're going forward here, and you don't need to stay stuck anymore. You can heal your life, and that's our message. And contemplative intelligence will help you get there.